children have. And so that's really the point of the bill today. There's a Connecticut study that says that there may be as much as 1 in 5 children are dyslexic. There's a study that the U.S. Department of Education put out that says 75% of the people in the Department of Corrections have dyslexia. And so I think that describes really a need that we have. And if we all think that reading is a priority, and I know that we all do, then I really think we have an opportunity here to make some real improvements. Indiana is not the first state to address this issue. A number of other states have done so in the last few years, including Texas, Tennessee, Ohio, Wyoming, and Kentucky, all doing it in similar ways, not exactly how we're doing it here, but in similar ways. And when we got to drafting this legislation, we took a look at those in an effort to try and find a resolution. But let me tell you just specifically what this bill does, then I'll sit down and let other folks address you that can talk about their unique experiences. First of all, it defines dyslexia, and we use what is essentially the International Dyslexia Association's definition of dyslexia. It's also used by other states. Tennessee, of course, comes to mind as the definition. It says that the education service centers may offer courses to teachers for dyslexia screening, intervention, and on various approaches, including the Orton-Gillingham, but it doesn't limit the approaches to that. And finally, it allows for any person who is in college to get an education degree. They should be taught on some level to identify children who might be dyslexic, and then to refer them to a multisensory team who has a capability of handling those. So that, in essence, is the spirit of the bill, and I'll be happy to take any questions if you have them.
Questions by the committee members? Okay. You want Representative Burton then to say something? Representative Burton, you may follow it. I might say that Representative Burton and I served for 15 years together in the Indiana House of Representatives. So in addition to John Barnes, I'm also a former member of the Indiana House of Representatives.
Chairman Cruz, members of the Education Committee, thank you very much. And that's true. We were in the same room, so he kind of straightened me out, if you will. I just have a few brief remarks. In 2013, I was at a fair in Johnson County, and Cheryl Clemens first approached me. I was surprised to learn that the National Institute of Health and the Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity, dyslexia is a neurological learning difference that affects 1 in 5 students. Unfortunately, less than 30% of these children are even identified, and far fewer receive the help they need. Without intervention, these students are more than twice as likely to drop out of school, and sadly, many end up in prison. And so it is an issue that's gone on for years. And the more I learned about this, as a matter of fact, there may be a possibility that I may have some dyslexia that this lady pointed out to me, because I've always had a problem having to read things maybe twice to understand it. If you go into a classroom and you see a child in kindergarten or the first grade that might be shy when they take out the books to start reading, or a child becomes disruptive when there's some kind of a math thing where we require some reading, and the question comes down, well, we just have a child there that's shy or that has a problem, and maybe it's a question of learning how to read in a different way. There's nothing wrong with these people. They just need to be identified and shown a different way to overcome that situation. That's what this bill's about. It's not about changing the teaching system or putting a bunch of requirements on teachers. It's about helping create a process in the education system for teachers to identify the possibility of dyslexia and other similar disorders, and then refer them to the proper people. They're not to make the decision whether this person's dyslexic or not, so it doesn't go there. And as it was going through the House, a couple things that we had to work on, I wanted to make sure the language was broad enough that it didn't just nail it down to dyslexia. There's other disorders that might need to be identified. And so I worked with Purdue. They helped me with some language to clarify and make sure that it was very broad in the language that mentioned dyslexia and other similar situations. And we also approached another thing in there that we talked about. One of the real training experiences that have enjoyed some success is the Orton-Gillingham training program. But here again, we had it in the original bill, and we didn't want to just narrow it down to that, so we put Orton, Gillingham, or other similar type education programs or identification programs. So we tried very hard to broaden it and work with the people that had an interest in this, including the psychologists in the schools, because if this kind of a problem comes up, they're referred to the psychologist in the school, and the school can determine if there's a problem. And finally, I want to just close by saying there's a couple people here we may have heard of that's experienced dyslexia: Steve Jobs, Charles Schwab, Tom Cruise, Richard Branson, Jay Leno, Henry Winkler, Steven Spielberg. All these people have dyslexia, and they overcame it. You're going to probably hear testimony from one of the young boys. This young man came up to me, and I don't know his age, but his Cheryl Clemens' son Joshua, and it just amazed me how sharp this young man is. She has 3 children with dyslexia, and she is a scientist, or she worked in science at Lilly, and she retired from that to devote her attention to helping children with dyslexia. So I'm sure she's going to be speaking shortly. I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Senator Mervan.
Senator.
Thank you. These centers where the teachers can go to get the education to deal with it, are they pretty accessible all over the state, or are they in great demand, or is it sort of a restricted
They're
place?
accessible. They can get them through the college system, because I talked to the people at Purdue. They can also do it online. There's other ways to do this. It's not a difficult thing. It's an identification situation more than learning about that. It learns about what the signs are with people with dyslexia. So it's pretty simple. The Orton Gillingham is a short process where they teach children, and I forget what the hours, and one of the ladies, Mrs. Clemens, is going to testify on that. She'll give you the idea of the time. But it's very accessible to schools, and it doesn't require a lot of extra education for the teachers. As they're going through the education process, this would just become part of the process.
It is part of the process, then it's... Oh, thank you very much.
And it identifies, and they haven't identified dyslexia before. This would identify it.
Thank you.
I'd like to clarify something that you and the sponsor said a lot of things here. But another thing I want to clarify is this, as a result of this legislation, if it becomes a law, will the School of Educations of our universities in Indiana begin to teach the new training teachers to detect dyslexia?
They are already doing some of this, Senator, but they will be doing more. Yes, it will be part of the curriculum.
Very good. Thank you for clarifying that. Any other questions? All right. Thank you very much, Representative Burton. We'll begin public testimony then, and our first witness is Dr. Denise LaSalle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. We have all heard stories of Albert Einstein's early schooling, and it was thought that he would never amount to much. Thomas Edison, Charles Schwab, and Elon Musk from SpaceX, we know their names because of their innovative achievements. They're among the famous dyslexics who made it. But for every Einstein, Edison, and Musk, there are dozens of others who don't. Dyslexia is the most common cause of reading, writing, and spelling difficulties, impacting 1 in 5 Hoosier children. It often goes undiagnosed until 3rd grade or later, when children are expected to read to learn rather than learn to read. And according to the National Institutes of Health, it accounts for half of our nation's high school dropout rate. National experts state that in dyslexia, there's not a knowledge gap, but rather an action gap. From brain scans, it's very clear that dyslexia is neurological. It's very real. Very bright individuals have difficulty making sense of written language or other symbols. When preparing these remarks, I asked one of my students to spell Senate. C-E-N-I-T, she said. Senate, just the way it sounds. English has 44 of these phonemes, or building blocks of sound. In turn, they are put together following rules and patterns to make over 1,600 different combinations. Most of us do it without even thinking about it. But for the 20% of children with dyslexia, this is like one of those 1,000-piece puzzles that your alleged friends give you for the holidays, where all the pieces are the same shape and you don't even know where to begin. Many students with dyslexia switch letters like B and D or P and Q. They may even transpose entire words, lose endings, or add letters. Words like that, who, what, and where are often dropped. Dyslexia can also impact the ability to work with numbers, especially things like times tables or others things that seem to be memorized so easily. But dyslexia and the family of related disorders is a learning disability, but not a thinking disability. And it's a tragedy that so many of these children are passing through our schools undiagnosed, misunderstood, and not meeting their potential. I have the honor of working with these children and their families on a daily basis at our Institute for Dyslexia Education and Pinnacle School and Learning Services, a regional resource in Bloomington for over 34 years. And thank you to many of our former and current families and students who are with us today. Indiana rightly prides itself on the creation of good jobs and preparing students for those jobs. Many of these jobs require the ability to think and to problem solve, areas where dyslexics are strong. But job preparation and being a literate citizen also involves the ability to read and to do math. Despite their best efforts, many caring and excellent Indiana public school teachers are frustrated because some children are not learning to read. Even with caring teachers, good schools, and parents who read with them at night, children with dyslexia still struggle in school. They will be afraid to read out loud. They may get stomach aches and ask to go to the nurse's office when it's time to read. And they'll get tears in their eyes when it's time to pick books from the library and their classmates go to the chapter book section while they have to get a little kid's book. And sadly, they are often seen as not trying when they are, with every fiber of their little beings. And logically, when things aren't working that do work for other students, they are often given more of the same. The extra reading classes usually pull them out of art, science, or other hands-on STEM subjects in which they have a keen interest and excel. A non-dyslexic child who is not reading well for various reasons will benefit from some extra reinforcement. But a dyslexic child who learns differently will become even more frustrated without the proper intervention, and over time will lose confidence in themselves and their ability to learn. I have seen many children in my practice who develop anxiety and even depression. Children with dyslexia are wired in a way that makes it more difficult for them to retrieve letters, sounds, and other symbols unless these are learned in a specific way. Instruction needs to be structured, showing them how sounds and letters relate. It needs to be sequential, showing how these sounds and letters act in words, and it needs to be multisensory, using all the senses for their brains to build patterns and meanings that they can retrieve later on. It's very much like building multiple pathways or roads that connect important destinations. The approach I have described and Representative Burton mentioned is evidence-based and recommended by the International Dyslexia Association. It is not a specific curriculum, but a method. Just as we know that students learn and retain science better when it is taught hands-on, Orton and similar structured, sequential, and multisensory programs are the only effective and recommended approach for teaching children with dyslexia. And there are a variety of excellent reading programs and software applications based on these approaches that teachers would gladly embrace. And all Hoosier taxpayers will benefit from this bill. When teachers can identify and work with dyslexic children early on, it will reduce the need for remediation and significant special education costs later on. It will also allow more dyslexic children to stay in public school. Right now, after experiencing years of humiliation, struggles, frustration, repeating grades, and failure, children with dyslexia and their families often have no other choice than to seek solutions outside of the public school. They use tutoring services, homeschool, or private specialty schools to get the education they need. We all care, but we just don't have the right tools in place. Contrary to what we might think, dyslexia is not adequately addressed by federal legislation and is left to each state responsibility. The future can and should be brighter for Hoosier children with dyslexia. Indiana can join our Midwest neighbors in Michigan, Ohio, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Illinois by enacting dyslexia legislation and giving teachers the tools they need to help educate these bright and deserving children. Thank you for your time and for assisting Hoosier children and for supporting House Bill 1008.
Thank you very much. Any questions of the witness? Senator Stoops.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Lesso, I think Senator Bray mentioned this. How many kids are estimated to have dyslexia?
1 in 5 is the standard estimate that's used.
That's incredible.
It's an incredible number of students, yes.
Is it more sex specific? Is it affect boys more than girls?
There's some perception of that because a lot of times boys with dyslexia tend to act out in the classroom to cover their learning difficulty, but genetically it's equally distributed among males and females.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you for your expert testimony.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for your work. Cheryl Clemens.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to come and speak in support of House Bill 1108. I just want to say ditto. My name is Cheryl Clemens, and I'm one of the leaders of Decoding Dyslexia Indiana. We're a grassroots movement of parents across Indiana seeking to raise awareness about dyslexia. I'm also the mother of 3 dyslexic children. It shouldn't be too surprising since, after all, the NIH and Yale Center for Creativity Dyslexia says it's 1 out of 5. Unfortunately, less than 30% are identified, and even more sadly is that far fewer receive the intervention that they need to be successful. Currently, unlike other states across the country, dyslexia isn't a word that's used in most of our schools. Even more surprising is most schools lack teachers trained in the identification and then the intervention of these children. My children have been very fortunate and are doing very well because we've been able to afford the $55 an hour twice a week tutoring in Orton Gillingham. In fact, my oldest son, he just completed his master's degree. You see, these are very bright children and have, by definition, average to above average IQs. Sadly, though, this is not the experience of most children with dyslexia in Indiana. They struggle and they wait. And they wait until they're at least a year to 2 years behind before they can be called specific learning having a specific learning disability. If only we could redirect some of the money that we spend testing and retesting these children to find that they're still behind and use it towards training teachers and providing meaningful multisensory interventions using systematic and explicit phonics. Teachers want training, and they want to see the children in their classrooms succeed. House Bill 1108, as it's written, would bring us closer to ensuring the success of the 1 out of 5 children who are dyslexic. It has the potential to completely change their lives. Thank you.
Any questions of the witness? All right. Thank you very much. Next we have Ann Guthrie.
I am Ann Guthrie. I am an early literacy librarian at Greenwood Public Library. I started out in my first life as a public school teacher, and as you know, teachers love to teach. And as I taught, I saw that about 20% of my children weren't learning how to read. And I was not trained effectively in how to teach reading. So I went back to school and got some graduate hours in remedial reading. Total waste of time and money. So when I had my children, I stayed home with my children and I homeschooled my children. My daughters did amazingly well. By first grade, they were reading on a third grade level. They were awesome. But my son inherited dyslexia. It runs in my family. My dad and my brother are both dyslexic. And I knew my Andrew was very, very bright. And I worked on phonics with him diligently for 6 years, blood, sweat, and tears. And I would just pray over his brain, and we would cry together. But I taught him how to read. If he had been in public school with his personality, he would probably be in our prison system today. Instead, with teaching him how to read and 4-H and all the mentors I had, he graduated from Purdue with a degree in flight. He is a helicopter pilot for the Marines. He flies Hueys. And then I became, I got my master's in library science. And I ran into Mrs. Clemens, who encouraged me to get trained with Orton Gillingham and has taught me how to infuse my story times with preschoolers with this multi-sensory, explicit, structured, sequential, cumulative phonics system. And the results I am seeing in my little 3 to 5-year-olds are amazing, whether they're dyslexic or not. This system works. It is amazing. And I just thank you for allowing me to testify.
You're welcome. Any questions? Okay. Thank you very much. Joshua Clemens.
My name is Joshua Clemens, and I am a sophomore in high school, and I am dyslexic. Thank you for the opportunity to speak for House Bill 1108. I struggled to learn and read in kindergarten and in first grade, and by second grade, I was really far behind. It didn't take an iRead test to see that. My teacher told my parents that I was capable of reading, but that I just didn't want to do it. She would send papers home that I had trouble reading and wrote in big red letters, "Joshua refused to do this." Teachers often identify kids like me as either lazy or slow. The other kids in the classroom also label kids like me as dumb. We are often picked on and bullied. Everyone seems to have a label for us, whether or not the school formally labels us or not. It wasn't until my parents took me for outside testing that I began to understand that I am dyslexic. Since dyslexia isn't recognized in Indiana, the school needed to wait until I was significantly behind so that I could qualify as having a specific learning disability. The label specific learning disability includes many different types of disabilities, including brain injuries. Dyslexia requires a specific type of intervention so that students like me are actually able to close the gap. Without the dyslexia label, we can only receive interventions that are appropriate for a group of disabilities, but never receive interventions that are specific for dyslexia. I am fortunate that my parents have been able to pay for Orton Gillingham tutoring. Orton Gillingham is a multisensory intervention that uses systematic and explicit phonics and has been shown to be successful intervention for many dyslexics. I increased 2 grade levels in only 6 months of tutoring. I think that training teachers to recognize dyslexia will help students get the right help. It will help them so others won't misunderstand them. I knew I learned differently and was frustrated because I couldn't learn the same way as my peers. The word dyslexia gave me the confidence that I could achieve success. Training teachers is a good first step. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Appreciate your personal testimony. It's good to have you here. You want to distribute those?
Yes.
You may do so. David will get it right over here. Yes. Thank you for testifying. Next we have former State Representative John Barnes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and former state representative and members of the committee. John Barnes, representing the Department of Education. We rise in support of this bill, and we want to thank both Representative Burton and Senator Bray for bringing this forward. We know that one of the most important things in the legislative process is refining a bill as it goes along. And I know that from working with Representative Burton in the House, we've had a chance to talk to him as he commented. Purdue through Susan Brock Williams had some changes that we thought were appropriate. He worked with us on that. And again, as was pointed out before, all you have to do is to look at all the co-authors on that bill, 52 names total, to see how concerned people are and what an important issue this is. I wonder if maybe Representative Burton had to cut it off after a certain point because all the names would not maybe fit beyond that. But anyway, and it's also bipartisan because as I read it, looks like 12 Democrats and 40 Republicans, so that's impressive. Again, as we said, going forward, this bill has evolved. We also appreciate mention of the good folks at the Education Service Centers who can, through a private-public partnership, sponsor and help with in-service training. So we think it's important to point that out. The only thing I would add to that is I have talked to some of the folks at iCase who I think maybe hadn't weighed in as much on this yet. Maybe some concerns about in the law conflicting definitions on learning disabilities, and I'm sorry that Senator Miller's not here, because I know that that's been kind of one of the things he's been working on this session, is to try to streamline and deregulate to a certain extent. And really, in terms of that and specific teacher testing for licensing, I think that the best thing, Mr. Chairman, about this committee and the way you run this is that there always is a few days between the time a bill is heard and it's voted on to talk to folks about the issues and possible refinements. So I would simply mention that and would offer my work as well as the chance to maybe reach out to the iCase folks and just make sure that everything's clear for them. But that is absolutely no reflection on the importance of this bill going forward. It's terribly important to make sure we get this done. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Any questions, committee members? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We now have an elite club of the former members of the Indiana House of Representatives. And Representative Burton, you'll join us someday. All right, next we have Michelle Gabbard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for allowing me to testify in support of House Bill 1108. My name is Michelle Gabbard. I am a parent of a dyslexic child. Our daughter, Sydney, is currently 10 and a half years old and in the 5th grade. She has a great sense of humor. She's loving and fiercely loyal and creative. She loves animals and playing soccer. She enjoys mysteries and adventure stories. She is naturally inquisitive about the world. In conversations, the questions she asks reveal that she is a deep thinker and intuitive. Not much gets by her. When our bright and articulate daughter was struggling in early elementary school, I began to wonder if she was dyslexic. Despite having a bachelor's degree in elementary education, I knew little about dyslexia. In 1st and 2nd grade, Sydney received Title I reading services and speech therapy. However, Sydney continued to fall further behind. It was then, after researching dyslexia, that we found a tutor specializing in Orton Gillingham. We also enrolled Sydney in a school for dyslexic children at the beginning of 3rd grade. During that year, she excelled academically and showed great improvement in spelling and reading, but there was still a gap. She won a year-end leadership award and her confidence was soaring. Due to my husband changing job locations, we had to re-enroll Sydney in public school for 4th grade. Soon into 4th grade, we realized a year of appropriate interventions in 3rd grade was simply not enough to catch up completely. In her 4th grade school year, we had her tested by a state licensed school psychologist. The testing revealed that Sydney scored in the high average range for IQ. Even more impressive, she scored in the 98th percentile for her verbal language skills. What was most concerning was that despite making huge strides in 3rd grade, our 2nd semester 4th grader had the reading ability of a beginning 3rd grader. The original gap was much larger than we realized, and now that she was no longer receiving interventions to address her dyslexia, she was noticeably falling even further behind. Because we had outside testing that specifically identified our daughter as dyslexic, we were eager to share that data with the public school so they could help her. However, schools don't have to consider outside testing, and they felt that the gap wasn't large enough for her to qualify and be identified as having a specific learning disability. Further behind before she could get the help she desperately needed. But Sydney wants to achieve and she wants to soar. Those failures will crush her spirit and be demoralizing. Getting her outside tutoring helped close the gap enough that she currently doesn't qualify to get the help she needs in school. The practice of waiting disables a student and puts them further behind their peers. Adding a definition and training teachers in identifying the early warning signs is the first step to proactively addressing the desperate need of 20% of our school-aged population. We can catch them before they fall.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I do have a copy if anyone wants one.
Okay, you can submit that up here then. Next we have Tamara Green.
I'm just going to say I am a daughter of a former House State Representative, 70s, Don Boys, Dr. Donald Boys. He was in the State House in the 70s. So, Greenwood. So, has nothing to do with this. I just thought we were sharing, so I thought I would
Woody
add.
Burton would
He
be.
did, yes. I spoke with Woody Burton last year about this time.
Is there somebody in between them? Was there somebody between the two of you?
Yes.
Okay.
Tony Muldor.
The actual intervention, and I think that's where the shift in resources would come in providing interventions, and I certainly don't have an answer.
Yeah, it seems like it would have to follow closely behind, because as soon as you get the kids in there and you're identifying them,
Doesn't it?
what do you do? How do you take care of them? How is that dealt with? I mean, I think it's a great bill. I think it's something that needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you. We now have Ronnie Embry.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Ronnie Embry, Indiana State Teachers Association. ISTA rises in support of the concept of this bill, although we do have some questions or some funding issues that Senator Stoops has brought to the forefront on this. Also, there's some questions as far as when you identify the students, it asks for, would this include current education students in schools of education, that they would need to have this prior to graduation, and when would they be able to get that coursework in if they're already scheduled to graduate or on a course and their schedule's already packed with the requirements that they have to have. So that would be a concern. The other piece is that I'm actually trained in Orton Gillingham, so I've done this, and I used to work at Camp Delafield. And although it is a kinesthetic and a visual and an auditory approach, it was not comprehensive enough for a lot of the students I worked with. So I actually developed additional curriculum for the camp under the Dyslexic Institute. So this is something I am familiar with. What I have found is it works with about 8 to 12% of the kids. The kids that it works with, it works fabulously, and it really does work well. But another concern is on the second page, although we support the concept, is identifying that is the only way. Some students do very well with a very phonemic approach, which Orton Gillingham is. You go through a set of cards, there's ways you trace your finger. I mean, there's some very kinesthetic things that are good practices, but some students also learn whole language that have language disabilities or have language disorders. So I wouldn't want to just limit. This is a tool, an effective tool with some students. So defining is in there as one form, and then we're also making curriculum decisions at the district level on that. And I certainly sympathize and empathize with parents, because all students have something to offer. All of them are bright. It's a matter, the brain is a pattern-seeking device, and sometimes people's patterns are different. And for example, when I was in college, I found out I had a reversal problem in a disability class, which I didn't know. I don't know my left from my right. I still have to make an L to when someone says go left. So I ran a lot of extra laps and things because my coaches thought I was being disrespectful, and I wasn't. I really didn't know the difference. But So I think we all can learn, and I really appreciate that Representative Burton and Senator Bray are bringing this forward, but there are some things that concerned, like I said, with the teachers or the people in the schools of education seeking licenses, the funding, and then would this also qualify someone for an IEP? Would it be other health impaired? What would dictate that the school implement the services? I want the kids to have the services. But with the cut budgets that we've had over the last few years, or the freeze on funding, that means right now class sizes are going up, and we need additional resource people, reading resource people with the training to do this. So that brings in some financial issues. But I think the concept is very good.
Thank you for your comments. Any questions? All right,
Thank you.
very much. All right, that ends our public testimony on 1108. We now provide opportunity for the sponsor and the author to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of brief comments, and I'll try and address a couple of questions. But first, I want to thank all the folks who are here to testify, and so many of you are volunteers who have your hearts and your hands both on this subject, so thank you for that. On the point about, well, maybe Orton Gillingham is one way to do this, if you look at the bill, it contemplates that. It mentions that, and I suppose perhaps it mentions it because at this point at least that's sort of the gold standard for a way to educate dyslexic children, but it also says other similar approaches. We were careful as we drafted this language not to lock a school or a teacher into one particular method because it doesn't work for everybody, and maybe the school has another philosophy that might work. One way or the other, it seems to be it has to be kind of a systematic, explicit, multisensory phonics type of an approach. But so we're not trying to lock a school in, but I don't think the language of this bill does that. And the other thing, I think there might be some merit, and we'll be happy as we go over this next week to talk to perhaps the colleges of education and see if they need, if they don't have the ability or the coursework already to address this issue. So I'll be happy to talk to folks about that and try and handle that if it is necessary. And the other thing I said with regard to resources, that's always a constant. But I think at least the way I see things going right now, that the children that are dyslexic probably are already in an IEP because they are struggling and they've been put into an individual educational plan of some sort. But again, it's not one that is currently being as helpful to them as it could be. So I don't know that we'll be adding additional people into that program because I suspect they're already there because they're having desperate troubles with reading. But I'd be happy to continue to work with folks as we go forward on this bill. But I appreciate your time today.
Okay. Representative Burton?
Thank you for hearing the bill, Chairman Cruz.
You're welcome. All right, we will close our hearing then on House Bill 1108.